So I will just run down very basics of the airbrush, taking care of it, maintaining it, all of that good stuff first. So the first thing I would recommend for anyone is to take your airbrush completely apart and familiarize yourself with the actual thing. That way you have a good understanding of how it works and what the parts look like and everything like that. The reason being that when you need to take it apart in the future, you won't have to, struggle quite as much. Let me grab my phone real quick. Alright. So I will just do that, and I'll show you all the different parts and explain what they do. So to take any airbrush apart, you always remove the back part first. This is called the needle chuck. You unscrew this slightly, you don't have to unscrew it all the way, and then you can take the needle out carefully. Then you can take the needle chuck all the way off. If you need to remove this back piece, you unscrew this section here. And you just pull it out. The trigger is a little bit different on every airbrush, but most of them just pull right out. This one you have to kind of turn a little bit to get it out. And on the front you have most airbrushes have a needle guard. That's what this piece is. On Badger airbrushes it tends to vary. You have a needle guard, however it operates differently. The needle guard is one and the same as this piece here, which is this is the piece that directs the airflow over the nozzle. And so when you take it off on a Badger airbrush, you'll be taking the nozzle out as well, because they're not separate pieces. But on Iwata's, you have two separate pieces. This is called the needle guard, or crown, often referred to as the crown. This is the front cap, and this is what has a small hole in it, which directs the airflow over the nozzle. And at the front you have the nozzle itself and me. Again, on Badger airbrushes it varies. You have a friction fit nozzle, so once you remove this piece, the nozzle will just come right off because it's not screwed in at all. However, on Iwata airbrushes you have to use this small wrench and very carefully loosen it, and then I like to remove it with my fingers. And that is the nozzle. So what do all these parts do? One quick thing, this is a MAC valve, or MAC valve. Good painters call it a MAC valve though. This allows you to adjust the airflow on the fly. You can also get these as an inline. So this is an inline MAC valve from Grex, the G-MAC. And it can be used to essentially change the airflow very quickly on the fly. So I can turn it left, left, left to increase the airflow, and turn it right to decrease the airflow. You would think it's a very unnecessary tool, but honestly, I thought so at first as well, but once I got one, I was like, wow, I need this. I'm glad I finally got one. So yeah, you can get airbrushes with it on the airbrush like this. This is the Iwata HPCS, or HPCH rather. but the inline one that I just showed you is a lot cheaper. It's like 20 bucks as opposed to $100 extra airbrush or something like that. So the airbrush body itself, down here you have the air valve, which this is a quick disconnect valve, recommended. Your airbrush came with one because I included one Rakshasa. Okay. Normally you have a little screw-on device here, and inside you can see the air valve. And this is where the air goes in, and when you press down on the trigger, which I will put back in the airbrush to show, you can see this small thing presses, and that is what opens the air valve to let air in. Then the air on all airbrushes, at least virtually all airbrushes, travels up this channel, and there's a hole, a tube inside of the body of the airbrush that runs the air up to the front. And you can see that bottom hole underneath the center hole is where the air comes in. When you have this front cap on your airbrush, the air essentially builds up inside of this cap and flows out between a very small opening in that hole. And the nozzle will be in the center of that, and between the nozzle and the air cap you will have airflow coming out. And that goes over the nozzle, over the needle, and it draws paint from inside the paint cup out and over the needle and onto your model. It doesn't mix inside or anything like that. The air flows out, the paint comes out, it creates a vacuum effect. I think it's called the Venturi effect or something like that. And it pulls the paint out. It's very simple. Relatively simple anyways. And the nozzle, which we have here, is a very fragile piece of metal and needs to be taken care of. Don't ever handle your airbrush a lot when you have the nozzle exposed. That's one of the easiest ways people damage their airbrushes, is by dropping it tip first on the sink or something like that, and you don't want to do that. So it's always best to have your needle and nozzle protected. This here is the needle chuck. This is what actually holds the needle in place, this piece here. You screw this on, and it tightens these three prongs, which you can see here. See how it's split three ways? It will tighten that onto the needle and hold it in place. So when you use the trigger, which presses up against this like so, you pull back and it pushes this like so. And that's what pulls the needle back and forth. So, very simple. Inside you have a spring. This is what gives you the tension pushing back as you press on the needle. This part is the back handle of the airbrush. It goes on the back here, of course. It doesn't have any, I don't know why they include an O-ring on some of these. It doesn't really need to be sealed or anything like that. This piece here is a needle stop, essentially. You can see as I screw it in, it screws this little tube in, and what that'll do is it'll push up against this and prevent you from pushing it all the way back. So it essentially lets you kind of control your airflow, not your airflow, sorry, your paint flow. So if you have a very specific task you're doing, like you're trying to get fine lines, you can screw this in further so that you're only able to pull the needle back very slightly. And that'll, so you don't make any mistakes. It's not really important, it's not necessary, but it can be helpful to some people. And this is the needle, of course. So that's pretty much all the parts of the airbrush. And like I said at the beginning, I would suggest everybody who's getting into airbrushing do that the first time when they get their airbrush. Take it completely apart, at least this apart. You don't need to take the air valve apart, even though you can. You don't need to take the MAC valve apart. But all the main workings, take it apart, look at it, put it back together, and make sure you understand how your airbrush functions, because it will help you when you have troubles in the future. So when reassembling your airbrush, as you just saw, I put the trigger in first, then the needle chuck, then I put the nozzle back on very carefully. And with screw-on nozzles, you have to be very careful. Again, this is how a lot of people damage their airbrushes. You put the wrench on and you tighten it until it stops, then you're done. Don't push it any further. Then put the cap on to protect the nozzle. Then put the crown on. Tauk asks, does the nozzle thing get loose after a while? Maybe after a long while, but it shouldn't. Not really, no. Once we put that in, you need to make sure the front end is all together, and then you can put your needle in very carefully. And one of the important things to note here is when you put your needle in, you need to make sure your trigger is seated correctly. If it's up too far, I'll just demonstrate. If it's up too far like this, then you will put your needle in. I'm going to put it in backwards here just to show. It might get stuck right there, and you might be jamming the tip of your needle into the back of your trigger, and that's going to dent or damage your needle, and you don't want to do that. So always be careful of that. Then we put the nut on to tighten the needle in. When you're doing this, always make sure your needle is all the way forward. Don't push it too hard, but make sure it's in there. And then tighten it down. And then put the back of your airbrush back on. Make sure that it works. Make sure that you're pulling the needle back here. And make sure that it's coming in and out of the front. And it is, so we're good. Tauk asks, is it necessary to get the nozzle off to clean, deep clean? The only time you should take your nozzle off to clean is if you need to clean the inside of the nozzle. If you have a really bad clog in the airbrush, then taking the nozzle off is definitely something you should do. And I will show you how to clean it real quick while I'm at this, because this is something that a lot of people also screw up. I should have mentioned this to begin with. But there's a tool like this that Amazon and eBay and a lot of websites sell, and it's very bad for your airbrush. You can see mine is bent, but normally they're very straight and they look like a needle, and they have a half grind on them. You can see here. These tools are terrible. You shouldn't use them for your airbrush ever, at all, for any reason whatsoever, because they are essentially a small steel pick, and you're putting it inside a nozzle which is also made of steel or sometimes even softer metals. And when you use that, I'll show you how it's supposed to be used. Basically, you put it inside the nozzle like so, and you spin it, and it's supposed to scrape the paint off the inside of the nozzle. The reason that's bad is because, like I said, it's metal on metal contact, and you're just going to scrape the hell out of the inside of your nozzle. It's not a good idea, because if you have tiny little scratches and dings inside your airbrush, paint will stick to that and stay there forever and ever and ever, and you will have a hard time cleaning it out, and you will get more clogs as a result. What you should do instead is use a toothpick. This seems like a kind of hanky-janky sort of way of doing it, but sharpen a toothpick, whittle it down nice and sharp so that it fits all the way in, and you should be able to just barely see the tip of the toothpick popping out of the nozzle, if you can see there. And that is how you should clean your airbrush, or clean your nozzle rather. And then use the toothpick and dip it in isopropyl alcohol, or this is lacquer thinner here. Poke it in the nozzle so you can see it coming out the other side slightly, and just spin it. And when you pull it out, you can see it's dirty. And because it's wood, it's not going to damage your nozzle at all. and it will get all the paint out of the inside of the nozzle very easily without any risk. Tauk asks, is airbrush cleaner isopropyl alcohol? It's hard to say what airbrush cleaners are composed of, because while there are MSDS sheets on most airbrush cleaners, it doesn't go into great detail about all of the ingredients. But typically airbrush cleaner does have some type of alcohol, ethanol, or isopropyl. I don't think it's usually isopropyl alcohol, but some sort of ethanol or alcohol product, in conjunction with other things like some have ammonia in them and things like that. Can you use your airbrush cleaner to also clean my brushes? No. I mean, you can, but if you're using it on natural hairbrushes and it has alcohol in it, which, like I said, a lot of them do, or most of them do even, alcohol dries out your natural hair bristles, so that's not a very good idea. Oh, again, one more thing before I move on to painting is using needle lube. Needle lube is really nice and useful. Comes in a lot of different varieties. This is Iwata's, this is Badger's. I use Badger most just because it's cheap and you get a lot of it. And all you do with needle lube is just wipe a little bit of oil on it, and then if I turn my exposure down a little bit, and then I just wipe it off on my palm. And you just want a very, very, very light coat of oil on the very, essentially, front inch or so of the needle. And what this does is it's going to prevent tip dry, or at least help alleviate tip dry, and it'll also help prevent clogs and such, because paint won't stick to the needle much, if at all, which is really good. Tauk asks, are there many kinds of Mac valves, or is it easy to find the right one? There are a couple different types of Mac valves. This is a quick disconnect Mac valve. So this has a quick disconnect here where you pull down and it just comes right out. There are ones where you screw them onto the airbrush directly, but more or less they're all the same or very similar. I would suggest getting a name brand one, either the Iwata or the Grex. This is the Grex, the G-Mac, as you can see, because cheaper quick disconnects I find leak a lot at the air valve here, and they can also come loose over time or get stuck, and it's just not very good. But otherwise, yes, it's pretty easy to find the right one. Let's see, what else? That's pretty much it. Does needle lube affect the spray pattern? Needle lube will only affect the spray pattern if you apply too much. If you apply too much, then when you here, if I get close to my table here, you'll be able to see oil coming off of your needle onto your surface if you have applied too much. And if you've applied too much like that, then you'll notice, and it can ruin your paint job, so don't apply too much. So next I will talk about other tools that are nice to have and such. Gunner machine oil for the lever, for the trigger, since this part. You could use machine oil. You can also just use needle lube. I would recommend getting needle lube for the needle anyways, and you can just use that for the trigger as well. You can also use, me and Nan have speculated that you can use mineral oil, because we believe this reg dab and such is essentially just mineral oil. Your trigger can get stuck sometimes, so when you're, one thing I didn't go over because I am forgetting, I'm not the most well prepared for this thing. I will show you real quick though. I need to take this off. I will answer that in just a moment, Ruxer. So, one important thing about your airbrush, every single airbrush, as far as I'm aware, has a part right back here inside the airbrush that is called your needle seal, or needle packing is how it's sometimes referred. And what that does is when you put your needle in into the airbrush, it goes through this needle packing, and the needle packing is a small screw with a little PTFE seal on the front. And when you tighten it, that PTFE seal, gets tighter, and it will squeeze the needle slightly. So if I could show you, possibly. It's way back in there. You may not be able to see it, but essentially you need a long screwdriver like this, a flathead. Pretty much every airbrush I've ever used has the same kind of needle packing, and you need to carefully take the long screwdriver, poke it down the back, and you will know when you've caught it because it will stop turning, and then you can just unscrew it. And this is the needle packing. As you can see here, it's a small nut with a little PTFE seal, and the needle goes right through that. So when you screw this into your airbrush, I would not recommend taking this out when you first get your airbrush. The reason being that if you take it out, you can put it back in wrong, and if you put it back in wrong, then your seal is not going to be good. And the reason this piece is important is because, as Talk was asking, why use needle lube on the trigger itself? Because paint can get into the back of the airbrush. Obviously there's a small hole in the back of the paint cup here where the needle goes through so that it can get to the front. And so because there's a hole there, that means paint can get through and get into the back of the airbrush. That's what the needle packing is there to prevent. It seals up against your needle and prevents paint from getting into the back of the airbrush. If you're finding that paint is getting into the back of the airbrush and your trigger is sticking, this is a really common problem that people run into. They will push their trigger down and it won't come up right away, or they'll push it down and it'll come up but the air is sticking on, and so it's still spraying air even though they're not holding the trigger down. That's happening because too much paint is getting into the back and it's affecting that small air valve there, and it'll make it stick. So that's one reason you want to lube it, is to keep it functioning correctly. So when you take the needle seal out though, it's very important. You can clean this with alcohol. I don't believe lacquer thinner or any other kind of chemical is really going to damage this. That's why they use PTFE, because it's a very solvent resistant material, as opposed to rubber, which melts in acetone and alcohol both. But when you need to put it back, just put it on the tip of your screwdriver and carefully thread it all the way back. I tend to give it a left turn until you can kind of feel a little click, and then screw it in righty-tighty. And then you have to put the trigger back in, and this is something you kind of just have to do out of feel, but once you have all these materials back in the airbrush, you don't have to screw everything all the way back in. You can put the back of your needle through and push it through that needle seal, and if you have it the right kind of tightness, you'll be able to feel it when you push the needle through. It'll kind of grip it slightly, and that's what you want, is you want it to grip the needle ever so slightly so that it seals the back of the airbrush. So Talc asks, is it possible to damage the needle packing like the PTFE seal? Is PTFE plastic? Is it possible to replace these small components if you lose them? or damage them? Yes. You can damage the PTFE seal if you ding it or damage it in any way, with physical damage. Solvents, like I said, shouldn't affect it, at least not in any significant way. And if you do lose or damage any part of the airbrush, pretty much every company offers either a warranty service or will sell spare parts. So if you damage your needle or your nozzle or the PTFE packing or the screw itself or anything, you can pretty much either buy replacement parts or contact the company that made the airbrush, and they may be willing to do warranty service on it. So that's pretty much everything about the airbrush as far as I can recall. So Ruxor asked, are there any cleaning methods or products to avoid that could be damaging to the O-rings? To the O-rings, like I said, the PTFE seal, if it's a white piece of plastic, which most seals in modern dual-action airbrushes are going to be that white plastic, that's PTFE. PTFE is very resistant. On Badger airbrushes, the nozzle at the front here has a PTFE seal on the back to seal it against the body of the airbrush so that you don't get air leakage. Those are not going to really get damaged with normal paint solvents, including lacquer thinner, alcohol, stuff like that is not really going to damage it. Pieces like this is a rubber O-ring on the back of this airbrush. Again, I don't know why they include this. This part of the airbrush does not actually seal against anything. I think it's just so that this stays tight. But rubber, black rubber, will get damaged in lacquer thinner. It'll also get damaged in isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol will dry the rubber out and can cause it to crack or break. Other things to avoid is ammonia. So this is Windex mixed with 50% water. This is something that I picked up from old people, because old people have a lot of DIY tricks for airbrushing, and one of them is to use Windex as a thinner as well as a cleaner. Some types of Windex and glass cleaner, you can use glass cleaner of any kind as far as I understand, but some of them have ammonia in them. Ammonia is bad for brass, and airbrush bodies, if you can see in the bottom there, that's slightly kind of brassy gold. Airbrush bodies are typically made of brass, machined brass. Small ammonia amounts in Windex and stuff are not very harmful, but you shouldn't be soaking your airbrush in pretty much anything. And I will show you why you shouldn't do that. This is an airbrush I've had since I was, I've had it for 8 or 9 years now. This airbrush has been through hell and back. As you can see, the cup is no longer nice and clean as this one is, because I soaked it at some point in I can't remember what it was. It was some sort of household cleaning product. The other reason that it looks like this is because of ultrasonic cleaners. Ultrasonic cleaners are very bad for airbrushes. If you look here, if I get close, you can see this here. That's the chrome plating coming off of the airbrush. The reason it's coming off of the airbrush is because I put this airbrush in its entirety inside of an ultrasonic cleaner at some point, and I let it run. That's a bad idea for airbrushes because they're chrome plated, most of them. A lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them are chrome plated. And ultrasonic cleaners are used in industrial applications to strip chrome off of metal. So it's not a very good idea to put it to put your airbrush in an ultrasonic cleaner. A lot of people recommend using them. Those people, in my opinion, are dumb, very dumb, and are potentially ruining your airbrush for you. Another thing, you can actually test this for yourself if you have an ultrasonic cleaner. If you put a piece of tin foil, aluminum foil, inside of the ultrasonic cleaner and run it, it will actually dent and damage and eat up the foil. And that's essentially what it's doing to your metal airbrush when you run it in there. And so inside this cup here, There are a billion tiny little pits now because I ran this through an ultrasonic cleaner, and you can see chrome is coming off everywhere because of that as well, and also because I soaked it in chemicals. It's just not a good idea. It erodes it. It causes the brass to blacken. You can see these lettering are supposed to be shiny brass, but now they're just black because they've been eroded from soaking. Let's see. Rocks or Socks asks, my airbrush is a cheapo no-name brand with black rubber O-rings, so that's good to know. Okay. Any reason to use an ultrasonic cleaner? The reason people recommend using an ultrasonic cleaner is because they're easy, and supposedly they can get paint out of the deep recesses of the airbrush, but in my opinion that should not be necessary. If you're cleaning your airbrush correctly, you should never need to deep clean it that severely. Even if you leave paint in your cup and let it dry overnight or something, flushing it out with cleaner, and then wiping the cup out, and then taking the nozzle off, taking the needle out, and just cleaning the inside of the nozzle like I suggested with a toothpick, and running cleaner through it a few times, that's good enough to clean the airbrush. The main areas of failure when airbrushing are the nozzle, and that's it. The nozzle and the needle, I guess I should say. Clogs tend to get stuck in the nozzle or in here in the paint channel between the cup and the nozzle. They'll get stuck in there. If they get stuck in there, it's not the biggest deal because this is not where your actual paint is happening. The paint is happening at the tip, at the nozzle and the needle conjunction, or junction, whatever. So if there's a clog, it's almost certainly always the nozzle. So clean the nozzle, keep the nozzle clean, all of that good stuff. That's the important part. So that's what I was going to get to next. This is a product. It's covered in stuff at the moment because I have lacquer thinner in here and I don't want to smell it. This is an airbrush cleaning jar. They are worth having, especially if you don't have a ventilator. What I am working on right now, if you can see, this entire thing is a ventilator. Ventilators are very important for airbrushing. If you don't have a respirator, if you don't have a ventilator, you at least need a respirator. But ventilators are very important because you can run a tube out of a window and airbrush right here, and it'll take the paint and get it away from your house and your room. These cups, though, are very nice if you don't have one because they typically come with a small filter in here, and that filter will filter some of the paint and spray out. So you put your airbrush here, you spray into it, the moisture will collect in the jar while some of it will come out of here, but it'll be filtered out okay. So this is a better thing to spray into than just spraying it into your room or something. I don't generally use it personally, but that's because I have a ventilator. So in terms of safety products, I'll run over that too. Like I said, a ventilator is very nice to have. It's not required, but it's definitely recommended. The cheapest one you can get is the No Name brand or Master brand. It's a big gray box with a PC fan in the back and a blue mesh filter in the front. It's not a very good ventilator, but it'll kind of do the job. If it's all you can afford, because that's the lowest price one you can get, it's about $100, then it's okay. But the one that I have is the Pace Peacekeeper, I think it's called, which is a silly name, but it's a great, really, really good ventilator that has an actual ventilator motor, and it pushes, I think, 140 CFM, which is really good because it takes basically all the paint particles and takes them out and takes them outside. If you don't have a ventilator, at very least you need to have a window open and a fan running, and you need to have a respirator on your face with a filter that's properly rated for what you're doing. So there, in the US, the filter for particulates I think is N95, And if you're using lacquers or alcohol-based stuff, then you need an organic vapor filter as well, because it's a different type of filter. It typically goes onto the N95 part. A regular dust mask, like an N95, dust mask that people wear, is not really the ideal. A respirator is much better because you get a good proper seal against your face. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything in terms of safety stuff. So I'm just gonna run through some basics of airbrushing and then we'll be done, I think. And yeah, you can make your own ventilator top. You can buy a box fan, which is literally just a square fan, and you can get a cardboard box, put the box fan inside the cardboard box, get a filter like this, similar to this, which is just a regular air filter that you use in your home, and you put that up against the box fan, you have the box fan blowing away from you, close the back of the box, you can cut a hole in the back and then run a dryer vent tube out the back and out of a window, and that is a relatively decent makeshift ventilator. So let's go ahead and demonstrate painting. So priming is very simple. Most primers are airbrush ready, so you don't need to thin them. Some, it's nice to thin because it can be too thick, depending on the needle size that you have in your airbrush. This is an Iwata HPCH, so it has a 0.21 millimeter needle, which is very small. Whereas something like this is the Iwata Revolution. This has a 0.5 millimeter needle, which is much larger. Typically, airbrush primers recommend 0.4 or 0.5 millimeter needles for spraying, and they recommend you spray around 18 to 25 psi. All of this is kind of just a general rule, not something you need to follow exactly. So, keep it in mind, but you don't have to always stick to that exactly as it says. Always shake your primer well before use, and then you can just dump it in. I'm just going to use a little bit just for demonstration purposes. This is an acrylic primer, so it doesn't need like heavy solvents. I'm just going to use Windex to clean it out once I'm done priming. And this is just Rakshasa knows what it is, but I'm just going to demonstrate. When priming, I tend to get about 2 to 3 inches away from the part, and I'm about 20 psi or so. I have my MAC valve open all the way, so I can feel that the pressure is fairly high, and then it's really just a matter of layering it on. You don't have to be super careful and do super light coats necessarily, because primer and paint in general tends to be kind of self-leveling when you're airbrushing it. It's not quite the same as brushing it on, because when you brush it on, you obviously need to thin it quite a bit and do thin layers in order to get a nice coat. But because we're airbrushing, we don't need to worry about that too much. So you can see it's relatively heavy. I hope I was in frame for all that. It's relatively heavy on there and it's still wet, but that's pretty much all you need to do for airbrushing primer. If you get texture or anything like that, it's usually because you're spraying too far away. So if you're spraying really far away like this, I don't know if you can tell, but you kind of tend to get some texture, you see. And the reason you get that is because when you're really far away from the model, the paint is actually drying in the air on the way to the model, so once it hits the model it's already somewhat dry, so it'll stick and build up texture rather than giving you an even coat. Like I said, generally 2 to 3 inches away is how close you want to be, and yeah, that's pretty much all you need to worry about with that. For cleaning, it's very simple. If you're using water-based acrylics, typically what people will do is run water through the cup first to get the paint out. That way you're not wasting cleaner, but I'm going to just use cleaner because I don't have water next to me. So. This is called backflowing. This is a really helpful thing to know when you're either mixing your paints or when you're cleaning as well. You essentially put your finger over the front of your airbrush, push the air down and pull back slightly, and what this is doing is it's forcing air back up and into the cup, which will mix whatever's in there with bubbles. So people use this both for mixing paints in the cup as well as for what I'm doing right now, which is I'm just trying to mix the primer with the cleaner so that I can then spray it out very easily. The audio is not gone, so I'm still here. I'm just not talking at the moment. Okay, so you can see that got most of the paint out, but I still have a ring. One thing that you should do, if you have a cap for the top of your paint cup, is you should use that, and that will actually help prevent this ring from appearing, because paint caps like this have a small hole in the top. This allows enough air through that you can get air into here, which allows the paint to come out, because if this is sealed, paint won't actually come out of the airbrush very well. But this also seals off the cup enough that the paint isn't going to dry on the inside of the cup very much. So it's very important. A lot of people don't use that. They should be using it though, in my opinion. When you have a ring like this of dried paint, I tend to use just a large brush like this. It's just a filbert. It doesn't really matter. Something large with a lot of bristles on it, and you can literally just swish it around inside with cleaner. You can see what tends to happen is you'll get these like chunks coming off. It's best if you dump this stuff out or take it out of the airbrush rather than spraying it through, because if you spray it through it can get caught and then it's going to take you longer to clean your airbrush out. I'll get to that in just a moment, Tom. So you can see now we're pretty much completely clean. There's no paint or anything. If this was the end, I'll get to that later. So for thinning airbrush or acrylic paints for airbrushing, I'll just use this. This is Vallejo Nocturna Cold Flesh. Always make sure you shake your paints really well. And no matter what thinner you're using, again I use Windex as thinner. It says alcohol on it, but this is Windex. Always put your thinner in first. And judging how much thinner you need is really something you're just going to learn over time through experience. Generally, I would suggest starting at about 50-50 paint to thinner, but it depends a lot on which color you're using, what brand the paint is. There's a lot of different factors, and it's not easy to recommend like one starting point or anything like that. But approximately 50% of paint to water is generally where I start at least. Once you have the paint in the cup, I tend to use a brush to mix it. make sure the brush doesn't have a bunch of dry stuff all over it, and then just stick it in and mix it. The reason I do this is because when you backflow the airbrush, while that's really helpful for mixing, it doesn't get all of the paint perfectly well mixed in. So I tend to mix with a brush first and then backflow. And when you backflow, it's going to bubble up like that. And then I'm just going to put the cap on, and that's it. Now we have paint, and we can use that to paint with. Again, just like when priming, you want to stay about 2 to 3 inches away from the model usually. Jedi, what was the mixture ratio? 50-50 is usually where I start. I can show you more about that in just a moment. Once you get that down, which really mixing is something of experience. It just really depends so much on a bunch of different factors, what paint you're using and all of that. It's not something that's easy to just be like, hey, use this exact ratio and this is what it should look like and all that. I will show you though one thing. A lot of people will say you need to make the paint look like skim milk. What they mean by that typically is that if you drag the paint up the cup and you let it flow down, it tends to kind of flow back down. You can see it runs back down the cup. Just like so. So you can kind of tell from that, but again, it's not an exact metric. It's not really easy to understand in a way that is going to get you the exact right results every single time. So again, something you need to just learn through experience and practice. The mixture that I have here is a pretty good general all-round like base coating and detailing amount of thinning. So I can base coat this entire part here just with this and it'll be fine. Something that I'm going to go over though is the pitfalls of thinning and airbrushing. A really common one that people run into is spidering, which I'm going to demonstrate right now. Spidering is when usually you're too close or your paint is too thin, and you start spraying and you spray and it spiders. It just goes all over the place, and you get these splatters like this. How do you avoid that? Well, that typically happens, like I said, either when your paint is too thin or your air pressure is too high. So right now my air pressure is very high. I have it all the way open, so I'm going to turn that down. All the way open at this point is about 20 psi or 25 psi, give or take. I'm going to turn the MAC valve down until I have more like 10 psi or 15 psi even. You want to just feel a very gentle airflow out of your airbrush. And the reason for this is when you get close, then you shouldn't have as much of an issue with spidering. The reason that it works this way is because when you have high airflow, you're essentially just blasting paint onto the surface, and any airflow you have going at the paint is going to push the paint around if it's still wet. And because we're working with acrylics do not dry in the air or on the model fast enough to justify using a high air pressure. If you're using solvent-based paints like Tamiya or AK Real Colors or any kind of lacquer or alcohol-based paint, then you can generally blast away with higher air pressure and it's not as big of a deal. But otherwise you have to really be careful and use your air pressure to your advantage as opposed to your deficit. So that's that. It's usually, like I said, it's usually a matter of lowering your air pressure. However, it's also possible that you have the paint thinned too much. If you have the paint thinned too much, then no matter what your air pressure does, it's still going to spider and not look good. So I'm just going to add a bunch of thinner here just to demonstrate this real quick. And yeah, Salty, I'll send you a link to a good one after this, assuming you're still in the chat, which you may not be. So I've thinned my paint down way too much at this point, and you can see even I have the air pressure very, very low, like 5 to 10 psi, and even still it's just going to go everywhere no matter what I do, because I have way too thin of paint here, and it's just not going to work right no matter what I do. Even if I just go very, very slow, you can see it's just spreading all over the place because there's too much fluid to how much paint there is. And so at that point you're essentially just spraying water as opposed to paint. Tauk asks, what's the lowest airbrush pressure you can use? It's hard to say. I think 5 to 10 psi is about as low as you should go. And what that's good for is generally detail work. If you're base coating, then spraying higher pressure is better because you want to build up those layers quickly, like I did on this side. So if you're base coating, higher pressure is generally better, and you want to use a slightly thicker mixture. But if you're doing detail work and stuff like that, then it's best to use lower pressure because you have a lot more control with that. You can make the paint a little bit thinner that way and still maintain good control of the airbrush. So I'm going to spray some of this out real quick, and then I'm going to demonstrate to you what you can do to fix overly thin paint. So let's say your paint is too thin like this, right? It's spidering everywhere, it just won't stay put. How do you fix that? The only way to fix it is to add more paint. It's literally the only thing you can do. You can either add more paint or dump the paint out and just redo it. But either way, it involves adding more paint back into the mixture. Once you add more paint back to the mixture, mix it up again. You know, you can test it against the wall if you're familiar with doing that. That looks like it's about thick enough. And then back flush to mix it up. Put the cup on. And then, you know, adjust your air pressure right, and then go back to it. And as you can see, we're back at a good we're back at a good thinning amount. So you can see I'm building up good base coats at this point. And that's that. You know, that's how it does. That's how it do. If it's too thin, add more paint. If it's too thick, I can show you what that looks like real quick. If your paint is too thick, the way to tell is pretty obvious. You'll essentially just have loads of speckling. So I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of thinner. Alright. So paint too thick, you'll see what happens is you get speckling. Can you see well here? Let me use this. You get speckling. So you see this rough texture. That's because the paint is too thick. If the paint is doing that, you need to add a little bit more thinner, just a drop or two, and mix it up like I said, and then you should be back to good. Tauk asks, do I ever want speckling? You can. You can use speckling like this to actually add texture to things. If you, one kind of special technique is to pull the needle back without pushing down on the pressure, and then spray it. And what you'll get is this kind of, you'll get larger kind of specks and speckles. It's not working great here because I think the paint is a little too thick, but that's an important thing to talk about as well. Is this, you would think this is a fairly straightforward thing, but which do you do first? Do you push down or do you pull back? Always push down and then pull back. You want to make sure your air is flowing, and then you release the paint. That's always how you should be doing it. When you're done spraying your layer, you want to push the needle forward and then let off the air. That's a very important thing to learn, because if you let me thin this a little bit more and I'll show you what happens if you don't. Alright, so if you pull back on the needle first and then spray, you can see you get tons of little splatters. That's because the paint is essentially building up on the inside of your needle here, and then when you spray, it's just going to splatter that everywhere. So this is something that a lot of people struggle with in the beginning. So always make sure you push air and then pull back on the needle. When you're letting off, you need to push the needle forward so that the paint stops, and then let off the air. It's really important to build a habit of this, because if you let it flick, or you let go of the air before you let go of the paint, like, okay, this is air, this is paint. If I let go of the air and then let the paint drop forward, or the trigger go forward, I'm ending up with paint on the front, and that's going to cause me to splatter. So if I'm working on a model and I'm going, hey, we're base coating, hey, this is great, hey, I love base coating, and then I pull back on the trigger still, but I let off the air, and then I let the trigger forward, and then I go back to my model and I'm like, hey, time to airbrush more, I'm just going to ruin my model. So that's something that you need to adjust to. It's a good idea to just get a piece of paper or something like that and just practice, essentially. How far do you push the trigger back? What do you mean, Tauk? And yeah, you can use this splattering stuff to get kind of, if my paint will stay thin enough, to get kind of galactic or starry patterns and stuff. A lot of people do star fields and stuff that way. You mean when I'm painting normally? How far back do I pull the trigger? That depends entirely on what you're doing. So if you're base coating, if you're priming, you can pull all the way back and just kind of blast. But if you're base coating or something like that, it's really just down to experience. It's something you have to adjust to, because I can't tell you exactly what you need to do for the situation in which you're in. So, if I'm base coating or something, then I'll stay, a little around halfway usually, I guess. If I'm doing detail work and I'm getting really close to the model and I'm working with low pressure, then it's more about keeping the air on and just very slightly pulling back the trigger so that I can get thin lines and such. If I'm priming, though, it depends on what I'm priming, but generally you can kind of just blast it on real heavy like, and you can see I made a mistake. But it depends on what you're doing is all. So that's pretty much everything everything that I can think of off the top of my head, and from Tauk's many helpful questions. So the last thing I want to go over is just cleaning when you're done airbrushing. How do you block airbrush paint from going everywhere? So you can do that a number of ways. I tend to use masking tape, which is somewhere around here. You can use stuff like this. This is to me a masking tape. You can use that. You can use silly putty. You can use poster tack like this. You can tear a piece off. Let me show you. You can tear a piece off and then cover a part that you need in poster tack. And then airbrush the piece, and then remove the poster tack, and you have masking. So that's an option. Another option is There's AK Interactive, I think, actually sells a masking putty, which is essentially just silly putty, but it comes in a can, and you get a larger quantity of it. You can use that stuff. You can also just use, yeah, like a piece of napkin or paper and just hold it like this, and then spray this part, and then you're done. You basically do whatever you can think of to block the air. Okay, Salty Senpai says, when using an airbrush, I've had several instances where for some reason paint would fire so long as I pushed down on the trigger, no pullback. Why would that happen? Did I have a spillage or backflow issue? So Salty, what you're saying is that paint would be coming out even if you have the trigger all the way forward, right? Right. That happens usually because of one of two things. Okay, either your nozzle is clogged, you have a chunk of dried paint inside your nozzle, and it's preventing your needle from going all the way forward, which will cause it to essentially just sit there and be slightly open all the time. If you are pushing down, you can tell if that's the case if you put your finger over the front of your airbrush, which, by the way, while I'm on that point, some airbrushes have a split crown, so there's a hole here, so you can't just put your finger over the front because you'll stab yourself. If that's the case, you can just pinch the front and then do this, and it'll backflow. So you can tell if you have a clog in the nozzle that's preventing your needle from going all the way forward by just putting your finger over the front and pushing down on the air without pulling back. If air is coming out in your cup, you need to clean your nozzle out, or at least you need to run cleaner through your airbrush multiple times. So, let's see. I had an issue where either no paint comes out or too much paint comes out. That's usually down to thinning, or your paint may have dried chunks of paint in it and it's just clogging up repeatedly. Using needle lube will also help with that. Things like that. But it's usually a clogging issue. Almost every airbrush issue that anyone has is usually down to cleaning. Almost always. So I'm going to show one more thing, and then if anyone has any more questions, I'll answer a couple more questions, and then we're done. So at the end of a session, this is the most important part of cleaning your airbrush when you're using it. You need to spray all the paint out of the airbrush completely. And then you need to take your needle out of the airbrush, wipe the needle off completely. You can see there's paint on the needle. It's very important to wipe that off. And then you need to run cleaner through the airbrush until it's completely clean. When the needle is out, cleaner will dip out of the front. I just hold my finger over it while I'm doing this stuff. And you scrub the inside of the cup, get all the paint mixed up and off of the inside of the cup, off of the bottom of the cup, the rims and everything. You can backflow slightly when you're doing this, and then spray that cleaner through. And you need to do this repeatedly, multiple times, until the cup is 100% clean and there's nothing dark or no dried chunks or anything like that coming out of the airbrush. Bubbling near the nozzle is fine. All it means is that there's probably paint on the threads and it's kind of allowing air to get through there. That only happens generally if you have the front clogged like this. The air has nowhere to go, so it'll come out of the cup and it'll come out of anywhere else that it can find a way to come out of. So again, I'm going to run more cleaner through until I know that the airbrush is completely clean, and I can know when the airbrush is completely clean based on how clear the cleaner is when it's in the cup. So looking into the cup, I can see that it's pretty clean at this point. I'm just going to run cleaner through it once more. I'm going to use my finger this time just to rub the insides here, just to make sure it's nice and clear, and then spray that cleaner through as well. So when you're doing this, you can tell that it's clean based essentially just on how clean the cup is. If you see paint at the bottom of the cup still, then you may need to clean more. If you look into that small hole at the bottom of the cup, if it's not clean, you can usually see a little bit of paint sticking out there. All you need to do is just essentially just keep running cleaner through until it's cleared. If it's not clearing out with cleaner, then you may have just dried paint in there that's from a previous session or something. As long as your airbrush is functioning well, that it shouldn't be an issue. It's not something you need to worry about. And the last thing, well, not the last thing, but one of the last things is clean off the external of your airbrush. Treat it well. You know, if you treat your airbrush well, your airbrush will treat you well. You know, you can use Q-tips, right? Q-tips to clean the front. You can just stick the Q-tip in the front here, twist it around a little bit, get it nice and clean, just like it's your ears. Except you're not supposed to use Q-tips in your ears, but I digress. Put some more cleaner in, maybe. You know, a little more cleaner never hurt nobody. Spray that cleaner through. Wipe that airbrush off, get it nice and shiny. Taking care of your airbrush is important. If you take care of your airbrush, you won't have as many clogs, you won't have as many problems. So take care of it. Do a good job of cleaning it and maintaining it. That means cleaning it right and cleaning it well. And the last step is, once you're done, use needle oil. Again, I just apply a little to the needle, and then I run it on my hands, put it in the airbrush. My needle chuck is too tight. Thread it into the airbrush, tighten that up, find my back, there it is, and then put it on. Spray it out, make sure the cleaner's out. You can back flush it just to make sure. And there you go. We're clean, we're good, we're lubed up, we're ready to go for the next session. That's really everything. Like, that's, if you do this stuff, you're not going to have a lot of problems. If you do have a lot of problems, you're welcome to tag me and ask. I can help with pretty much anything. But yeah, it's very simple, relatively simple. Most of it is just a matter of experience and practice. Use your airbrush, practice with it, mess around with it, play with it with paper or models. It doesn't matter too much what you're using it for. As long as you're using it, you're going to learn how to use it better just by doing. Practice taking it apart, practice cleaning it, maintaining it, all that. Definitely get needle lube. It is very important. And yes, Salty, this is needle lube. Needle oil, needle lube, it doesn't really matter. That's what it is, it's oil. Mineral oil, machine oil may work. I haven't tried that, so I can't say for sure. But some kind of needle lube or oil, same thing. But it's the same lube. Yes. You have trigger lube? What is trigger lube? From what company? Oh yeah. Yeah, the lube that comes with the Wada is the same. You can use that on the needle. So yeah, that's everything. Mac valve, great. Very good to have. Needle lube, very important. Always have it. Cleaner, I use Windex. Thinner, I use Windex. Good alternatives are Airbrush thinner from Vallejo. That's, in my opinion, the best airbrush thinner that I've used. That's actually a commercial product and not just household cleaner. In terms of purpose-made airbrush cleaners, again, the Vallejo stuff is good. Badger's airbrush cleaner is also very good. So I would stick to those if you're going to buy something other than Windex for your airbrush. And yeah, that's everything. So any other questions? Jedi asks, I don't know if you got to it, but what's a good way to get my tip to stop drying so much again? Using needle lube will prevent tip drying. If that's not working, then using a small amount of retarder in your paint when you're airbrushing can help that, but a little goes a long way, and if you use too much, you're never going to be able to airbrush easily because the paint won't dry fast enough, so you'll just be layering on globs of paint and you'll have to wait forever for it to dry. Salty, is Vallejo Flow Improver worth it? I don't know, honestly. I've only used the airbrush thinner. I haven't used the Airbrush Flow Improver. I honestly am not sure what the difference is, so I can't really speak to that. Talc asks, do I use distilled water or tap water? It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter at all, in my opinion, unless you have hard water. If you have really hard water, which means that your water has loads of minerals in it if it comes from the ground, then you should probably use distilled water or bottled water of some sort, because if you're using hard water, it can build up crust deposits inside your airbrush, and you don't want that. But if you just have city water, it shouldn't be a problem. I don't actually use water in my airbrush. I only use cleaner. And like I said, this is Windex. It's an isopropyl alcohol bottle, but this is just Windex. I buy the concentrated stuff in a jug, and I mix it 50-50 with water, and I just, use this. I use that to clean the paint out. I use that to clean at the end. I use that for thinning. I use it for everything. When I'm not using that, I use this, which is, this is a Real Colors bottle, but this is just lacquer thinner that I bought at Walmart. It's very cheap, very good for cleaning out Tamiya paints and lacquer paints. Do not use it to clean out water-based acrylics. And one last thing, do not use isopropyl alcohol to clean out water-based paints unless you're physically deep cleaning the airbrush and not spraying it through. If you spray it through, it can turn water-based acrylics into goop and they won't come out of the airbrush. So you don't want to use that. Is it cheaper to buy the concentrated stuff for Windex? Yes. You can buy these large jugs like this, huge jugs, and it's like $1 or $2, and you can mix that 50-50 with water, the whole thing, and that's going to last you a long, long time. It's way cheaper than buying Badger airbrush cleaner or Vallejo thinner and cleaner. Those things are like $5 to $10 a bottle, whereas you can get a bottle of Windex, couple dollars, thin it 50-50, and you're good to go for a very long time. So yeah, that's airbrushing. At least that's the introduction to airbrushing. Those are the basics. Should get you around. So hope that helps.